Being in a relationship with someone who is emotionally immature can be exhausting. If you know, you know. Whether it's a partner or a parent or a boss or a colleague or even a good friend. Having a relationship, especially a close relationship with someone who lacks emotional maturity, is hard. It can be frustrating. It can actually even make you question or doubt yourself. It can be hard on your self-esteem. And so today we're going to just look at some of the key features of emotional immaturity just so that you know what it looks like so you can spot it. And then we're going to go more deeply into how to deal with it, how you can deal with it so that it's not quite so hard, not quite so frustrating, not quite so overwhelming. Yeah? But first, if you're new here, my name is Julia Christina. I'm a registered clinical therapist, a researcher, a coach, a speaker, and the author of my book, Drive Your Own Darn Bus. And I help heart-centered humans think better, feel better, show up better, and live better so that they can like themselves and their lives more every day. So when it comes to emotional maturity or lack thereof, let's all get on the same page by understanding that emotional maturity is defined by someone's ability to manage their emotions and take full responsibility for their actions. Now, it's true that people have different capacities of emotional maturity. It's not an all or nothing. It's not a they got it or they totally don't. It can vary from person to person, and it can also vary from situation to situation. Someone might be very professional and put together at work, but then when they get home, they display all of these emotionally immature behaviors. Or it can go the other way, and they can be fine at home, and then when they get to work, they act in all of these emotionally immature ways. So when we're talking about emotional immaturity, what does it look like? Well, first of all, someone who is emotionally mature won't go deep. They skirt around and they avoid hard conversations, especially when it has to do with them. Maybe they're willing to talk about deeper things on a global level, like global warming or the income discrepancies in different countries, including our own. But when it comes to things that are personal about them, they really avoid talking about those things, having those more personal, hard conversations. Another thing to look out for when it comes to identifying emotional immaturity is that they will often lie to get themselves out of difficult conversations or situations. Not necessarily big lies, but they could just be like little lies, like, oh, sorry, I can't talk about this, or, oh, look at the time, I got to get going, or, oh, I've got something else going on, I can't deal with that. Another sign of emotional immaturity is they often make everything about them. And as soon as I say that, you know exactly what I mean. They also tend to get defensive easily, where they get reactive instead of reflective when you bring up an issue or you address a problem. They will blame you, they might even judge you or criticize you, turn it on you. They have a hard time admitting mistakes or taking responsibility for their part of the problem. Has this ever happened to you where you've gone to someone with something that was bothering you, something that you were finding hard, something that hurt your feelings, something you found difficult, and you addressed it with them? And instead of them acknowledging that or recognizing your experience, even if they weren't intending it to be that, but they go immediately into either defensive mode or blaming you mode. And you enter the conversation with a complaint or something that you want them to acknowledge and perhaps even take responsibility for and apologize for. And you end up being the one apologizing by the end of the conversation. And you leave that conversation being like, how did that happen? So first of all, we didn't resolve the issue in the first place. And second of all, I just took it on as my fault and somehow apologized to them. And it's not a sincere apology. It's almost like you got coerced into the apology, or you felt like you had to make the apology, or maybe you just wanted to apologize because they were getting so worked up and upset that you just wanted to end the conversation and smooth things over as quickly as possible. because they couldn't receive what you were saying and have a mature conversation about it, let alone work on figuring out how to get through it. Another sign of emotional immaturity is that they just lack good communication skills. They don't really know how to talk about what they're thinking or what they're feeling, which might make them more likely to avoid it, skirt around it, laugh it off, make jokes about it, or they lash out. That is another really key defining feature of someone with emotional immaturity, is that they get angry easily, they have big emotional outbursts easily, or they go internal and will either avoid, give the silent treatment, shut you out. So they have those big emotions and they don't know what to do with them because they lack that emotional maturity. So they either lash out or they shut down, leaving you to feel very confused or very hurt or even really worried. The next sign of emotional maturity is that they often lack or have low empathy. Because again, everything is about them and their feelings and what matters to them and what they're going through, what they have going on, where it's almost like everyone should cut them some slack because they have so much on their plate, or they're going through so many hard things, or they have so much responsibility, or life has given them the rough end of the stick, or maybe even they think that they're more important than other people. And so how they're thinking or feeling matters more. And so then there's that lack of empathy for other people, how what they're doing or how they're acting or how they're treating someone might be having an impact on them. And maybe it's not all the time, and maybe it's not in everything, but you definitely notice that, where they will do something or say something, but then not really show any remorse, not really come back and apologize for it, maybe because they've justified it in their own mind. Well, I wouldn't have done this if you hadn't done that. Which then leads us naturally to the next one, is that they often have poor self-reflection abilities. So they lack that ability to take a step back and be like, maybe I could have done that better, or maybe I did contribute to that problem, or I wonder what part I played in this, because usually when there's an issue, it takes two to tango, maybe even more than two. So those are some of the main signs of emotional immaturity. And it's important that we're able to recognize them for what they are so that we know what to do when those behaviors show up. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute here. But it's also important that we're able to recognize them, because what can often happen if you're in a close relationship with someone who is emotionally immature, because they're so good at deflecting, of blaming, of making you think that things are your fault, or that it's because of you, or you just need to change and then everything would be okay, or you're being too uptight, or you're being too difficult, whatever those things are, that it can really start to make you doubt yourself. It can really make you start to question yourself. It can chip away at your self-esteem and your self-worth. So being able to see that, and then moving in to trusting yourself and not letting someone derail you or your sense of self or your sense of worth, is so important. If you want extra help with that, I have a guide. It's called The Simple Steps to Self-Trust. If you find that you often blame yourself for things, or you don't trust yourself, or you don't know if it's all your fault or what's really happening, you don't feel secure in who you are, to build a real authentic sense of self-worth, self-confidence, self-esteem, it starts with the foundation of self-trust. And then it's so much easier to grow all of those things from there. So make sure you grab that guide, The Simple Steps to Self-Trust. I once dated someone who was quite emotionally immature, but I didn't see it at first, because when we first were starting to get to know each other, we got along really well. We had so much in common. We had great chemistry. We had such a great connection. We could talk about most things forever, except for when it came to talking about things in our relationship. Being open, being honest, being vulnerable, working out issues that were coming up. That rarely went well. There was a lot of deflection, a lot of blaming, a lot of avoidance. And I, at first, didn't really know what was happening. And I started to think that everything was my fault, that I just needed to be more like this, that I just needed to not let things bother me, that I just needed to be better at going with the flow. And maybe there was some of that when it comes to emotional maturity, again, reflecting on taking responsibility for our own part in things. But I realized that I was the one that was taking responsibility for everything, and they weren't really taking responsibility for anything or being willing to do anything to help work things out and get through the challenges that we had. And so on that note, let's talk about what we can do to handle not just the other person, but also ourselves when we have some kind of relationship with someone who is emotionally immature. First of all, learn to take really good, really deep breaths, because it can be frustrating. You can feel like you're banging your head against a wall when you're trying to work something through and you feel like you're getting nowhere. It can just be a lot to be in a relationship with someone who is emotionally immature. So really learning how to regulate your nervous system by taking a lot of deep breaths, because what you don't want to do is let their emotional immaturity trigger yours. Getting into a big conflict with someone who is emotionally immature is not going to end well. It's not going to get you anywhere because, again, they lack that ability to take the personal responsibility, to admit to mistakes, and often they lack the willingness to want to work something through. Often with them, it's about winning or being right. And so you can't fight fire with fire. Your job is to regulate yourself. Funnily enough, with this person that I had dated, I tried this once. I tried to fight fire with fire because I just came to a point where I was so frustrated with them. I was so overwhelmed with emotion with how they were handling a conflict that we were having. And I got pulled in and I started telling them all the things that I saw in them about their lack of emotional maturity, about how selfish they were, about how they never thought about anyone other than themselves, about how they didn't have the capacity to have a real, authentic, deeply honest, connected relationship. And I was saying all of these things. I was so angry and I lost it. And you know what their response was to all of this? Not the, oh, wow, you really made me see some things about myself that I need to reflect on, that I need to go deeper on, that I need to change. Absolutely not. All they did was double down and blamed me. You lost it. You flipped out. You said some awful things to me. I don't know if I can ever forgive you. That was inexcusable. So again, they went into that deflection. Absolutely no self-reflection. And fair enough, usually when we flip out on someone and our presentation isn't the most clean and classy, they're going to go into defensive mode. That's true for most human beings, but even more so with someone who lacks that emotional maturity. They're not going to back down. And if you bring it up, then they're just going to double down on their emotional, immature ways of handling things. So what do you do instead? It's something called immediacy. It's a skill in counseling that we learn in grad school about calling out a behavior that is happening in the moment. And so if you're just having a regular conversation with them and then you notice something shift, they start to get defensive, they start to get critical, they start to turn on you, and you don't really know what happened, and you start to feel small, you start to feel anxious, you start to feel upset. Instead of reacting to it, get curious about it and call it out. What just happened? We were having a conversation, and all of a sudden the energy shifted and you started getting upset with me. You started blaming me. You started criticizing me. You started coming at me. What's going on? Now, they may or may not be able to have the capacity to self-reflect and be like, actually, I got kind of triggered by that. It brought this stuff up. I started thinking about this and then I ended up taking it out on you and I'm really sorry. They're probably not going to be able to get to that level because that's emotional maturity. But you not getting pulled into it and kind of cutting off the behavior by addressing it in a non-confrontational way, you're just getting curious, can pull the conversation out of that dynamic. And you can use that professionally, you can use that personally, you can use that in most relationships to be like, hey, what's going on? I noticed that you're getting upset. I noticed that the energy shifted. I noticed tension in your voice. What's happening right now? And that can prevent it from getting to that more high conflict, more kind of worked up place. The next thing to do is to point out the behavior. I notice that when we're having a discussion about something, you really quickly get quite irritated or quite upset, and then you start yelling and calling names. What's up with that? What's going on? Or with this person that I was dating, I said to them one time, I notice that when I bring up something that you've done that put me off or hurt my feelings or had an impact on me, you immediately either shut down and won't talk about it, or you blame me or make some kind of excuse for it and tell me why it was really my fault, why you did that thing. Why is that happening? I'm bringing this up because I want to work it out, because I want to talk about it. Can we not do that? And so pointing out some of those behaviors. Or if you're with your partner and you're like, hey, we had a big talk about dividing the household duties more equally because I was feeling like I was taking on most of it. And we agreed that we would take on these different roles and participate in these different ways. And you haven't been doing it. Help me understand why. Instead of going into that blame of like, you did this and you should have done that. And what's your problem? And all that kind of stuff, which is, again, is that more emotionally immature way of handling things. Pointing out the behavior and getting curious about that. What's going on there? Help me understand. What happened? And then what are we going to do to work this out, to handle this better, to solve these problems more effectively? So point out the behavior, not in a reactive or accusatory or blaming way, in just a neutral, I noticed this happening, help me understand why. What's going on here? Try that instead. The next way to handle it is to set really clear boundaries. If when you're trying to have an honest or open discussion, you're trying to work something out, you're addressing a difficult dynamic or situation or issue in the relationship, and immediately they start to get defensive, they start to get angry, they start to blame, they start to deflect, they start to yell, you are allowed to set a boundary and say, I am here for a discussion to work this out, but if you start being nasty, name-calling, yelling, screaming, I am no longer going to engage in this conversation. That is my boundary. Or if you notice yourselves having a discussion and it just seems to be this kind of like back and forth, not really getting anywhere, each person is trying to win, you can call it and say, listen, this conversation is going nowhere. I'm not going to talk about it anymore, so let's talk about it another time when we're both feeling more calm. Or even simply, there's sometimes some conversations that don't need to be engaged in. If someone is just like standing there and criticizing your choices or making you question yourself or being kind of condescending, you can decide my boundary for me is I'm just not going to engage in those types of things. I'm just not going to have that conversation. I'm not going to get pulled into that. It's not going to go anywhere helpful, and that's not how I want to spend my time or my emotional energy. You can actually even just get up and walk away from a conversation, walk away from someone who is being unnecessarily unkind to you, that's just sort of making those passive-aggressive or even aggressive remarks. And that is you setting a clear boundary, just saying, I'm not participating in this. I'm not doing this. I'm not available for this. Like the saying goes, don't get into a pissing match with a skunk. And that is what you have jurisdictions over. You can't control how someone else handles things, how someone else reacts to things, how someone else is unable to regulate their emotions, but you always have the choice of how you're going to handle it and how you're going to handle yourself. You can't change someone who is emotionally immature, but you might be able to have some influence over them if you change how you are responding to them, how you are dealing with things, where you're not just letting it be okay, letting them walk all over you, take advantage of you, but you're also not getting into it with them and fighting back at that stooped level, where you are working on your own emotional maturity and how you're going to handle things. You are learning to have that trust in yourself so that you're not so easily derailed by someone else's inability to manage themselves. Having that solid, secure sense of yourself comes from that self-trust. And so working on that and also working on your emotional regulation, which is again going to come from learning how to trust yourself and feel more secure in yourself, because you're not going to feel so easily threatened, triggered, or put off by other people's words or actions if you are solid. You're not going to be so shakeable if you are grounded. And grounding yourself in that self-trust. So you can grab that simple steps to self-trust. Let me know in the comment section below, which one of these are you going to start working on? What's one thing that connected with you? I would love to hear. And as always, it is so good to have you here. Until next time, take good care of yourself. Take good care of those around you. Bye for now.